The night sky over Normandy crackled with distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. June 5th, 1944, hours before dawn, would touch the hedgerows of northern France. Captain James Hollister gripped the side of his C-47 Dakota, feeling the aircraft shudder through another pocket of flak. Below, somewhere in that blackness, lay Drop Zone Dog. Somewhere down there, 80 men of the 101st Airborne would scatter like seeds across enemy territory, and most would land nowhere near where they were supposed to. The jump light flashed red. Hollister's stomach tightened. He'd trained for this moment for 2 years, memorized every field and every road on the maps they'd studied until the paper wore thin. But maps couldn't account for wind. Maps couldn't account for clouds thick enough to hide the earth. And maps certainly couldn't account for what happened when your navigation equipment failed and your pilot was guessing coordinates in pitch darkness. The light turned green. Hollister jumped into nothing. The opening shock of his parachute yanked him upward before gravity pulled him down again. He couldn't see the ground, couldn't see his fellow paratroopers, couldn't see anything but darkness and the occasional flash of distant artillery. When his boots finally hit earth, they hit hard, and he rolled into what felt like a drainage ditch filled with cold water that soaked him to the bone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He lay there for a moment, breathing hard, listening. No voices, no movement nearby. Just the sound of his own heartbeat and somewhere far off, the rumble of war moving across the French countryside. Hollister checked his rifle, found it intact, and slowly stood. He was alone in occupied France with no idea where he was, and dawn would bring German patrols. This was the nightmare scenario every paratrooper feared. The scattering, the isolation, the realization that your carefully planned military operation had just become a desperate game of hide-and-seek in enemy territory. But what Hollister didn't know yet, what none of the 80 men scattered across 12 square miles of Norman farmland could have known, was that their salvation wouldn't come from military precision or advanced equipment. It would come from a French farmer who understood animals better than any soldier understood war. His name was Pierre Leclerc, and for 3 years he had lived under German occupation, watching foreign soldiers walk his fields, requisition his livestock, and turn his peaceful farm into a staging ground for the Atlantic Wall. He was 56 years old, weathered by decades of working the land, and he had spent the last week preparing for something his neighbors thought was madness. The resistance had brought him a message 10 days earlier. American paratroopers would be coming, they would be scattered, they would be lost, and they would need a signal, something that could guide them without alerting the Germans who patrolled these roads every night. Pierre had listened carefully, nodded once, and set to work on a plan that seemed absurd until you understood how well this man knew his animals. For 30 years, Pierre had raised sheep and cattle on these rolling hills. He knew every sound his livestock made, knew the difference between a bleat of hunger and a bleat of fear, knew how sheep responded to different whistles and how cattle reacted to specific calls. The Germans who occupied his farm heard these sounds every day and thought nothing of them. Farm animals made noise. That was simply the way of things. But Pierre Leclerc had spent the last week training his sheep to respond to a very specific sequence of sounds. Not natural calls, but a pattern. 3 short bleats, 2 long ones, then 3 short again. Over and over, he'd practiced with his flock, using food rewards until they would respond on command, gathering and moving in predictable directions. The Germans never noticed. Why would they? A farmer calling his sheep was as ordinary as sunrise. The resistance had told him the paratroopers would carry small metal clickers, devices that made a sharp double-click sound. 1 click meant friend, 2 clicks meant identify yourself. But scattered across miles of darkness with Germans everywhere, those clicks would be nearly useless. Men would be too afraid to use them, too isolated to hear responses. Pierre's solution was simpler and far more brilliant. He would use his livestock as living beacons. When Captain Hollister finally oriented himself that night, pulling his compass from his waterproof pouch, he realized he'd landed nearly 3 miles south of Drop Zone Dog. The hedgerows here were thick, ancient walls of earth and vegetation that turned every field into a fortress. He could hear gunfire to the north, probably where the main drop had occurred. He needed to move, but in which direction? Faint at first, almost lost beneath the sound of distant artillery, sheep bleating in a strange rhythm. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. It repeated, steady as a metronome, coming from somewhere to his northwest. Hollister froze, listening. His training hadn't mentioned anything about livestock signals, but something about the pattern felt deliberate, unnatural. 2 miles away, Private First Class Danny Kowalski heard the same sound. He'd landed in an apple orchard, his parachute tangled in branches, and spent 20 minutes cutting himself free. Now, crouched behind a stone wall with his rifle ready, he listened to sheep bleating in that odd sequence. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. It was coming from the same direction as what looked like a farmhouse on a low hill. Across the scattered drop zone, 80 men heard variations of the same thing. Some heard sheep, others heard cattle lowing in rhythmic patterns. A few heard what sounded like a farmer's whistle, repeated at regular intervals, always coming from the same general area. The sounds were loud enough to hear from a distance, but ordinary enough that German patrols paid them no attention. After all, farms made noise at night. Livestock got restless. This was France. Pierre Leclerc stood in his barn, watching the darkness through gaps in the wooden walls. He'd positioned his sheep in the west pasture, his cattle in the north field, creating overlapping sound patterns that would guide scattered men toward his farm from multiple directions. Every 10 minutes, he'd move to a different location and trigger the sequence again. 3 short calls, 2 long, 3 short. His sheep responded beautifully, trained so well that they performed even in darkness. The Germans, stationed at the crossroads half a mile away, heard the noise and ignored it. One soldier even joked about French farmers and their obsession with livestock. They had no idea that every bleat, every low, every whistle was part of a carefully orchestrated signal designed to pull American paratroopers out of the darkness. Captain Hollister moved carefully through the hedgerows, following the sound. His instincts told him this was either a trap or a miracle, and right now he needed to believe in miracles. The pattern never wavered. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. It reminded him of Morse code, deliberate and precise. When he finally reached the edge of the farm, he saw a figure standing near a barn, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The man was older, wearing work clothes, and he was making a whistling sound that caused sheep in a nearby pasture to bleat in that same strange pattern. Hollister raised his rifle, then lowered it. This wasn't a German trap. This was something else entirely. Pierre saw the movement and raised one hand slowly, palm out. He'd been briefed on American hand signals by the resistance. The paratrooper approached cautiously, and Pierre spoke the only English phrase he'd practiced. American? Friend. Come. Hollister nodded, relief flooding through him. How many others? Pierre held up both hands, fingers spread. 10. Then again. 20. He kept repeating the gesture. More coming. The livestock signals had been working. Over the next 2 hours, paratroopers emerged from the darkness like ghosts. They came alone or in pairs, drawn by the rhythmic bleating that cut through the chaos of their scattered drop. Private Kowalski arrived first, followed by Sergeant Bill Thompson, who'd landed in a creek and nearly drowned. Lieutenant Robert Chen appeared from the east, bringing 3 men he'd gathered along the way. By the time the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of grey, 37 paratroopers had assembled at Pierre Leclerc's farm. They huddled in his barn, weapons ready, while the farmer continued his livestock symphony, drawing more men out of the Norman countryside. The Germans never suspected a thing. To them, it was just another night of farm animals making noise in the darkness. Pierre's wife, Marie, had prepared what food they could spare: bread, cheese, water from their well. The Americans ate gratefully, speaking in whispers, still processing what had just happened. They'd been scattered across enemy territory, completely lost, and a French farmer had gathered them using sheep calls. Captain Hollister studied the man in the dim light of a shuttered lantern. Pierre Leclerc didn't look like a military strategist. He looked like exactly what he was, a farmer who knew his land and his animals. But in that knowledge lay a kind of genius that no army manual could teach. "How did you know?" Hollister asked through hand signals and broken French. "How did you know we'd come?" Pierre smiled, his weathered face crinkling. He pointed to the sky, then to the sheep, then to his ears. He'd been listening for aircraft, waiting for the drop, and when the planes came, when the sky filled with parachutes he could barely see in the darkness, he'd activated his system. The livestock calls continued throughout the night. By dawn, 62 paratroopers had made it to the farm, 62 men who should have been scattered, isolated, and likely captured or killed. Instead, they were assembled, organized, and ready to execute their mission, all because a French farmer understood that the most sophisticated signal in the world was useless if it couldn't be heard, but animal sounds traveled for miles and raised no suspicion. As morning light touched the hedgerows, Pierre led the Americans through a series of underground root cellars and hidden passages he'd prepared. The Germans would be sweeping the area soon, looking for paratroopers, but these men would be hidden, gathered, and ready to strike when the moment came. Hollister shook Pierre's hand before descending into the cellar. There were no words adequate for what this man had done. The farmer simply nodded, already planning his next move. 18 paratroopers were still missing, still scattered somewhere in the darkness that was rapidly becoming daylight. Pierre had work to do. He returned to his fields, calling his sheep in that same pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. To any German patrol, he was just a farmer tending his flock. But to the American soldiers still hiding in ditches and hedgerows, those bleats were a lifeline, a beacon guiding them home. The genius of Pierre's system wasn't in its complexity. It was in its simplicity. Germans expected codes, radios, light signals, things that looked like military operations. They never expected livestock. They never suspected that the sounds they heard every day, the ordinary background noise of occupied France, could be weaponized by a man who understood animals better than any intelligence officer understood: espionage. By mid-morning, 74 of the 80 scattered paratroopers had reached the farm. 6 were still missing, likely captured or killed in the initial landing. But 74 men lived and fought because a French farmer had spent a week training sheep to respond to specific calls. 74 men who would go on to help liberate France, all guided by the most unlikely signal system in the history of modern warfare. The American commanders, when they finally learned what had happened, were stunned. Intelligence officers tried to understand how a civilian with no military training had accomplished what their sophisticated planning couldn't. The answer was simpler than they wanted to admit. Pierre Leclerc knew his farm the way soldiers knew their weapons. And in knowing it completely, he'd found a way to turn ordinary farm sounds into extraordinary salvation. The Germans never discovered what happened that night. Their reports mentioned scattered American paratroopers, some captured, most escaped. They never mentioned livestock signals because they never heard them as signals at all, just the normal sounds of a French farm going about its business under occupation. But in the barns and root cellars of Pierre Leclerc's property, 80 Americans understood they'd witnessed something remarkable. They'd been saved not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by a farmer's intimate knowledge of animal behavior and his willingness to use that knowledge against an occupying force that thought it controlled everything. As the sun climbed higher over Normandy on June 6, 1944, those 74 men prepared for the battles ahead. They would fight. Some would die. But they would do it together, assembled and organized, all because they'd followed the sound of sheep bleating in the darkness. And Pierre Leclerc returned to his fields, calling his animals in patterns only he understood, waiting for the next opportunity to turn his farm into a weapon. The Germans walked past him that morning, never suspecting that the quiet farmer feeding his sheep had just orchestrated one of the most successful assembly operations of the entire airborne invasion. In war, geniuses often wear uniforms and carry sophisticated equipment. But sometimes, just sometimes, it wears work boots and speaks the language of livestock. And on that night in Normandy, that kind of genius saved more lives than any radio signal ever could. The root cellar beneath Pierre Leclerc's barn smelled of earth and stored vegetables. 74 American paratroopers sat in near darkness, their weapons across their laps, listening to the muffled sounds of German patrols passing overhead. Captain Hollister checked his watch. It was just past 8 in the morning on June 6, 1944, and somewhere to the north, the largest amphibious invasion in history was hitting the beaches of Normandy. Above them, Pierre moved through his daily routine, with practiced calm. He fed his chickens, checked his cattle, and exchanged pleasantries with German soldiers who stopped to requisition eggs. The occupiers had been using his farm as a waypoint for 3 years. They knew his face, knew his habits, and suspected nothing. To them, he was simply another French farmer who'd learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But beneath his boots, hidden in tunnels he'd spent months preparing with the resistance, sat enough American firepower to cause serious problems for the German defensive positions in this sector. The paratroopers weren't just hiding, they were staging, waiting for the right moment to strike at the communication lines and supply routes that ran through this area. Sergeant Bill Thompson sat next to Private Kowalski, speaking in whispers. "I've been in the army 6 years," he said quietly. "Been through jump school, ranger training, every kind of tactical course they got. Nobody ever taught us to follow sheep calls." Kowalski grinned in the darkness. "Maybe they should. Worked better than our navigation equipment." Lieutenant Chen moved through the cramped space, checking on his men. Most were remarkably calm, considering they'd been scattered across enemy territory just hours before. The assembly at Pierre's farm had given them something precious that scattered paratroopers rarely had: confidence. They weren't isolated anymore. They were a unit again, with enough men and firepower to actually accomplish their mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Above ground, Marie Leclerc brought her husband bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. She spoke quietly in French, words the German soldiers couldn't hear from their position near the road. "How long can we keep them hidden?" Pierre chewed slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "Until dark. Then they move." He paused, watching a German truck rumble past. "The resistance says the invasion has begun at the beaches. These Americans need to cut the roads before reinforcements arrive." Marie nodded. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for it alongside her husband. Their farm had been a quiet place once, before the war. Now it was a battlefield waiting to happen. She returned to the house, carrying herself with the same calm dignity she'd maintained through 3 years of occupation. In the cellar, Captain Hollister was organizing his men into squads. 74 paratroopers was a significant force, larger than the scattered groups most units had managed to assemble after the chaotic drop. He had 2 demolition specialists, 3 medics, and enough ammunition to cause real damage to German positions. But first, they needed intelligence. Pierre descended into the cellar through a hidden entrance in the barn floor. He carried a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed, showing every German position within 5 miles. Resistance had been mapping the occupation for years, noting patrol patterns, supply depots, and communication lines. He spread the map on the earthen floor, using a small lantern to illuminate it. Through broken French and hand signals, Pierre explained what the paratroopers needed to know. The German command post was 3 miles east, in a requisitioned chateau. The main road carried supply trucks every 2 hours, and most importantly, a critical communication line ran through a small bridge just 1 mile north of the farm. Cut that line, and the Germans in this sector would be blind when they needed to coordinate their response to the beach landings. Hollister studied the map, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. This wasn't the mission he'd trained for, but war rarely went according to plan. His original objective had been to secure Drop Zone Dog and link up with other units pushing inland from Utah Beach. Instead, he'd been given something potentially more valuable: detailed local intelligence, and a staging area the Germans didn't know existed. "The bridge," he said, pointing to the map. Pierre nodded. "We hit it tonight." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Above ground, German activity increased as word of the invasion reached inland units. Trucks moved with greater urgency. Officers shouted orders. The occupation forces that had grown comfortable in their positions suddenly remembered they were at war. But none of them suspected that beneath a quiet farm, American paratroopers were preparing to strike at the very infrastructure they depended on. Pierre continued his livestock calls throughout the day, hoping to draw in the remaining scattered paratroopers. The pattern had changed slightly. Now it was 2 short bleats, 3 long, 2 short. A different signal for daylight hours, one that sounded even more natural to German ears. By late afternoon, 3 more Americans had found their way to the farm, drawn by the sounds that seemed ordinary to everyone except those trained to listen for them. 77 men now, 77 out of 80 who'd jumped into darkness over Normandy. The survival rate was extraordinary, almost miraculous, and it all came down to a French farmer who understood that the best codes were the ones that didn't sound like codes at all. As sunset approached, Pierre brought food down to the cellar. Not much. His farm had been stripped nearly bare by German requisitions, but enough. Bread, hard cheese, some preserved vegetables, water from his well. The Americans ate gratefully, aware that this man and his wife were risking execution by hiding them. The Germans didn't show mercy to French civilians who aided Allied forces. Captain Hollister pulled Pierre aside, speaking slowly in his limited French. "Why do you do this? Risk everything." Pierre's answer was simple. He pointed to his fields, his barn, his home. "They took my country," he said in French. "They took my son." His voice caught, slightly. "He was in the army, killed in 1940 when France fell." He looked directly at Hollister. "You give me a chance to fight back. I take it." The words needed no translation. Hollister understood loss. Every man in that cellar understood it. War had taken something from all of them, whether it was homeland, comrades, or innocence. What united them now, French farmer and American paratroopers, was the simple desire to take something back. As darkness fell, the paratroopers prepared to move. They checked weapons, distributed ammunition, synchronized watches. Pierre led them through a series of hedgerows he knew intimately, paths that avoided German observation posts. The livestock had gone quiet now, their work done. The 77 men they'd gathered were about to execute the mission those scattered jumps had nearly made impossible. The bridge was small, built of stone and wood, crossing a creek that wound through the Norman countryside. But the communication cables it carried were vital. German forces used them to coordinate movements between coastal defences and inland reserves. Cut those cables, destroy that bridge, and confusion would spread through their command structure at exactly the moment they needed clarity most. Hollister split his force into 3 groups. One would secure the approach from the east, blocking any German response. Another would hold the western side, preventing retreat or reinforcement. The third, led by his demolition specialists, would wire the bridge for destruction and cut the communication lines. It was a textbook operation, the kind they'd practiced dozens of times in training. But training had never included assembling your force by following sheep calls to a French farmer's barn. The teams moved into position with professional silence. These were elite troops, trained for exactly this kind of night operation. The months of preparation showed in every movement, every hand signal, every calculated step. By 2200 hours, they were ready. Pierre watched from a distance, his silhouette barely visible against the night sky. He'd guided them this far, showed them the paths and positions. Now the soldiers would do what soldiers did. He offered a small prayer, not to any god in particular, just to the darkness itself. Let these men succeed. Let their courage mean something. The demolition team worked quickly, placing charges with practiced efficiency. The communication cables were cut first, severed cleanly so the Germans would receive no warning. Then the explosives were set, enough to drop the bridge into the creek below and make the crossing impassable for the trucks that rumbled through here carrying supplies and reinforcements. At 2300 hours, Captain Hollister gave the signal. The charges detonated with a roar that split the night. The bridge collapsed, stone and timber tumbling into the water below. The communication cables sparked and died, their signals gone, silent. And in that moment, a small piece of the German defensive network in Normandy simply ceased to exist. The response came quickly. German troops arrived within minutes, shouting orders, searching for the saboteurs in the darkness. But the paratroopers had already melted back into the hedgerows, using the same paths Pierre had shown them. They moved like ghosts through terrain the Germans thought they controlled, disappearing into a landscape that sheltered them. By midnight, all 77 men were back in the root cellars beneath Pierre's farm. The Germans searched through the night, frustrated and confused. They found nothing. No tracks, no evidence, just a destroyed bridge and silent communication lines. The paratroopers they'd expected to capture were somehow organized, coordinated, and dangerous. In the darkness of the cellar, the Americans allowed themselves small smiles. Their first mission in occupied France had been a complete success. The bridge was down, the cables were cut, and they hadn't lost a single man. Above them, they could hear German trucks rumbling past, forced to take longer routes now that the bridge was gone. Each delay, each moment of confusion, helped the Allied forces pushing inland from the beaches. Pierre descended into the cellar one more time that night, carrying water and a bottle of Calvados he'd hidden from the Germans for 3 years. He poured small measures for Hollister and the other officers, raising his own cup in a quiet toast. No words were spoken, none were needed. The old farmer and the young soldiers understood each other perfectly. As dawn approached on June 7th, the paratroopers prepared to move again. They couldn't stay at the farm. The Germans would expand their search, and eventually they'd discover Pierre's role in hiding them. The resistance had arranged a new location, deeper in the bocage country where the hedgerows grew thick enough to hide an army. Before they left, every American shook Pierre's hand. Some tried to thank him in broken French. Others simply nodded, their respect conveyed through silence. The French farmer accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, the same way he'd accepted everything the war had thrown at him. He was just a man doing what needed to be done, using the skills he had to fight the war that had taken his son. Captain Hollister was the last to leave. He clasped Pierre's shoulder and spoke in careful French. "You saved us. You saved the mission. We won't forget." Pierre smiled, his weathered face showing years of hard living and harder losses. "Win the war," he said simply. "That is how you remember." The paratroopers disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, moving toward their next objective. Behind them, Pierre Leclerc returned to his fields, calling his sheep in the ordinary patterns of an ordinary farmer. The Germans who passed by that morning saw nothing unusual. Just an old man tending his livestock, living out his quiet life under occupation. They never knew that his livestock calls had assembled 77 American paratroopers. They never knew his root cellars had sheltered the men who destroyed their bridge and cut their communications. They never knew that the greatest signal intelligence operation of the Normandy invasion had been executed not by trained specialists with sophisticated equipment, but by a French farmer who understood that sheep calls travelled farther than radio signals and raised no suspicion. In the weeks that followed, Hollister's force became one of the most effective paratrooper units operating behind German lines. They struck supply convoys, ambushed patrols, and created chaos in the German rear areas. Every success traced back to that first night when they'd been scattered and lost, saved by the genius of a farmer who'd turned his livestock into living beacons. The official reports called it successful assembly despite adverse conditions. The military historians later wrote about improvised signals and local cooperation. But the 77 men who were there knew the truth. They'd been saved by sheep calls in the darkness, guided to safety by a pattern of bleats that sounded natural to everyone except those listening for salvation. Pierre's farm survived the war, though just barely. The Germans never discovered his role. And when Allied forces finally pushed through in late June, the old farmer was still there, tending his reduced flock and maintaining his quiet dignity. He never spoke about what he'd done, never claimed credit for the lives he'd saved. To him, it was simply what any decent person would have done when given the chance. The liberation of France came slowly to Pierre Leclerc's corner of Normandy. While the great armies clashed at Caen and pushed toward Paris, the Bocage country changed hands quietly, almost reluctantly. By late July of 1944, American forces had secured the region, and the German occupiers who'd walked Pierre's fields for 3 years were gone, dead, captured, or retreating eastward. Captain Hollister returned to the farm in early August, this time riding in a jeep rather than parachuting through darkness. He brought with him a battalion commander, a chaplain, and official recognition from the United States Army for the French farmer who'd saved 77 paratroopers with nothing more than trained livestock and extraordinary courage. Pierre received them in his farmyard, dressed in the same work clothes he'd worn the night of the invasion. Marie stood beside him, her hands clasped together, uncertain about all the attention. They were simple people who'd done what they believed was right. The ceremony felt strange, almost embarrassing. The battalion commander, a colonel named Richardson, spoke through an interpreter. "Mr. Leclerc, the United States Army wishes to express its profound gratitude for your actions on the night of June 5th and 6th. Your signal system allowed for the successful assembly of scattered airborne forces, resulting in the destruction of vital enemy infrastructure and the preservation of American lives." Pierre nodded politely, uncomfortable with the formal language. Hollister stepped forward and spoke more plainly. "You saved us, Pierre. Every man who made it to your farm that night knows it. We're here to say thank you." What Pierre didn't know, what the Americans had only recently discovered through their intelligence networks, was just how significant his livestock signals had been to the broader invasion. The bridge his assembled paratroopers destroyed had been scheduled to carry German panzer reserves toward Utah Beach. The communication lines they'd cut had prevented coordination between coastal defenses and inland units for nearly 18 hours, crucial hours when the Allied beachhead was most vulnerable. The military analysts tried to quantify the impact. How many lives saved by delaying those panzer reserves? How many successful landings because German commanders couldn't coordinate their response? The numbers were impossible to calculate precisely, but the conclusion was clear. One French farmer's improvised signal system had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the 77 men he'd directly sheltered. The irony wasn't lost on the American intelligence officers who studied the operation afterward. They'd spent millions developing sophisticated radio equipment, code books, and communication protocols. They'd trained specialists for years in the art of covert signaling and assembly procedures. And in the chaos of actual combat, what worked better than any of it was a farmer making his sheep bleat in patterns. Colonel Richardson presented Pierre with a handwritten commendation, signed by General Dwight Eisenhower himself. The words praised his innovative use of agricultural knowledge in service of Allied military objectives, and his extraordinary courage in the face of enemy occupation. Pierre accepted it with quiet dignity, though he couldn't read English and wasn't entirely sure what all the formal language meant. What he understood perfectly was the look in Hollister's eyes, and in the eyes of the other paratroopers who'd come back to visit. These were men who'd been lost and afraid, scattered across enemy territory in the darkness, and his sheep had led them home. That was simple enough. That was real. The Americans asked him how he'd developed the idea. Pierre explained through the interpreter, describing years of working with livestock, understanding their vocalizations, knowing how sounds carried across the Norman countryside. The Germans had occupied his farm, but they'd never really understood it. They saw fields and animals. He saw a language, a communication system that predated radios and codes by thousands of years. "Shepherds have been calling their flocks since ancient times," Pierre said simply. "I just made the calls mean something, different for one night." The military men nodded, taking notes, trying to capture his wisdom for future operations. But even as they wrote, they understood this wasn't something that could be easily replicated. What Pierre had done required intimate knowledge of a specific place, specific animals, and the specific sounds that would seem natural to occupying forces. It was genius precisely because it was unrepeatable, tailored perfectly to one moment in one place. Over the following weeks, more paratroopers returned to visit the farm. Some brought gifts, chocolate, cigarettes, small luxuries that were precious in war-torn France. Others simply wanted to shake the old farmer's hand and see the fields where they'd assembled that night. Pierre welcomed them all with the same quiet grace, offering what hospitality his depleted farm could provide. Private Kowalski came back in September, bringing with him a camera. He took photographs of Pierre standing beside his sheep, the same animals, whose trained bleating had guided men through darkness. The images would later appear in American newspapers with headlines like "Farmer's Genius Saved Paratroopers" and "Sheep Calls Guided D-Day Heroes." Pierre never saw those newspapers, never knew he'd become a small footnote in the legend of the Normandy invasion. What stayed with him more than any official recognition was a quiet conversation he had with Sergeant Thompson one afternoon in late summer. They sat on a stone wall overlooking the fields, sharing calvados that Pierre had finally felt safe enough to bring out of hiding. Thompson spoke some French now, enough to make himself understood. "You know what I remember most?" Thompson said, watching the sheep graze peacefully below them. "It wasn't the jump or the fighting or even the bridge operation. It was hearing those bleats in the darkness and knowing somebody was out there trying to help us. We'd been taught that France was occupied, that we couldn't trust anyone. Then your sheep started calling, and I knew we weren't alone." Pierre nodded slowly. "You were never alone," he said. "France was occupied, yes, but French people were still here, still fighting in our own ways." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "My son died, fighting the Germans in 1940. I couldn't save him, but I could save you. That was enough." The conversation captured something the official reports and commendations never could. Pierre's livestock signals weren't just about military tactics or clever improvisation. They were about resistance, about refusing to surrender completely, even when your country had been occupied for years. Every bleat of those trained sheep was an act of defiance, a declaration that the Germans might control the roads and the towns, but they didn't control everything, couldn't predict everything, couldn't prevent a farmer from turning his knowledge against them. As autumn arrived and the war moved eastward, life on Pierre's farm slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. The Germans were gone. The paratroopers had moved on to other battles. The fields needed planting, the livestock needed tending, and there was a future to rebuild. But the memory of that night remained, carried in the minds of 77 men who'd scattered across occupied France and been gathered by the sound of sheep. Some of those men didn't survive the war. They fought through the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, and fell in the final push into Germany. But those who did survive never forgot the French farmer who'd saved them. In the decades after the war, several made pilgrimages back to Normandy, searching for the farm where they'd hidden in root cellars and planned their first mission. Pierre grew old working the land he'd never left. Marie passed away in 1956, and he continued alone, his sheep and cattle his constant companions. Visitors still came occasionally, American veterans bringing their children or grandchildren to see the place where something remarkable had happened. Pierre would show them the barn, the fields, tell them about the signals if they asked. But mostly he'd just stand there, letting them remember in their own ways. In 1968, a French journalist finally convinced Pierre to give a formal interview about his role in the invasion. The old farmer, now 79, sat in his kitchen and told the story plainly, without embellishment. The journalist kept asking him to explain how he'd thought of using livestock signals, what had inspired such genius. Pierre's answer was characteristically simple. The Germans knew radios and codes and military signals. They didn't know sheep. So I used sheep. He shrugged. It wasn't genius. It was just paying attention to what the enemy didn't understand. That interview was published in a small regional newspaper and quickly forgotten by everyone except military historians who specialized in unconventional brisard warfare. But the veterans who'd been there needed no reminder. Their children and grandchildren heard stories about the French farmer whose sheep saved their fathers. The tales became family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that heroism sometimes wore work boots and smelled like livestock. Pierre Leclerc died in 1972 at the age of 83. His funeral was attended by 7 American veterans who'd made the journey back to Normandy one final time. They carried his coffin to the small cemetery overlooking the fields where his sheep had once called out in the darkness. As they lowered him into Norman soil, one of them, Private Kowalski, now old himself, whispered the pattern they'd all followed so many years before. 3 short sounds, 2 long, 3 short. The sheep in the nearby pasture, descendants of the flock Pierre had trained, looked up briefly at the noise, then returned to grazing. They didn't understand the significance. They were just animals doing what animals did. But the men standing at the graveside understood perfectly. Those simple sounds had meant salvation once. They'd meant that someone was thinking about scattered soldiers in the darkness, guiding them home. In the years that followed, military academies began studying Pierre's improvised signal system as an example of adaptive thinking in warfare. The case appeared in textbooks about unconventional tactics and local resource utilization. Graduate students wrote dissertations analyzing how agricultural knowledge could be weaponized. The analysis went on for decades, scholars trying to capture in academic language what Pierre had understood instinctively, that the best codes were the ones nobody recognized as codes at all. But the real legacy lived in memory rather than textbooks. The 77 men who'd assembled at his farm that night carried the story with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children. Their children told their grandchildren. And in that telling, Pierre Leclerc became something larger than a farmer who'd trained his sheep to bleat in patterns. He became a symbol of what ordinary people could accomplish with extraordinary courage and simple genius. The farm itself gradually disappeared. Pierre's nephew inherited it but eventually sold the land to developers. By the early 21st century, a small housing development occupied the fields where paratroopers had once hidden in root cellars. The barn was gone, replaced by suburban homes. The stone walls where Sergeant Thompson and Pierre had shared calvados were torn down to make room for roads and driveways. But a small memorial remained, erected by American veterans in 1994 on the 50th anniversary of the invasion. It stood at what had been the edge of Pierre's property, a simple stone marker with words in French and English. Here, a farmer's wisdom guided soldiers home. Here, sheep calls saved lives. Here, ordinary courage accomplished extraordinary things. Visitors to Normandy's many D-Day sites rarely found this memorial. It wasn't on the main tourist routes, wasn't part of the official museum circuit. But those who did find it, especially veterans or their families, understood its significance. They'd read the inscription and imagined that June night in 1944, when scattered paratroopers followed unlikely sounds through enemy darkness. The story endured because it revealed something profound about the nature of war and resistance. In an age of sophisticated technology and complex military planning, victory had sometimes come from a farmer who understood his animals well enough to make them speak in code. The massive machinery of modern warfare, all its radios and equipment, and carefully planned operations, had been trumped by sheep calls in the Norman darkness. Military historians debated whether Pierre's contribution had been strategic or merely tactical. Some argued his assembly of 77 paratroopers was a minor incident in a massive invasion. Others pointed to the bridge destroyed, the communication lines cut, the panzer reserves delayed, and saw cascading effects that potentially saved hundreds or thousands of lives on the beaches. The truth, as it so often was, lay somewhere between. Pierre Leclerc hadn't won the war, but he'd helped 77 men survive its opening hours, and those men had gone on to fight through France and Germany, each carrying with them the memory of being lost until sheep calls guided them home. The ripples extended outward in ways impossible to measure precisely but undeniable in their existence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. What remained, decades after the last veteran had passed and the farm had vanished beneath suburban development, was a story. A story about a French farmer named Pierre Leclerc who spent a week training sheep to bleat in patterns, then used those patterns to assemble American paratroopers scattered across occupied Normandy. A story about how the most sophisticated military operation in history was aided by the oldest form of communication humans had ever known, the calling of livestock. And in that story lived a truth that no amount of technological advancement could erase. Sometimes, genius wasn't about complexity or innovation. Sometimes it was about understanding the simple things so completely that you could make them extraordinary. Pierre had understood his sheep, understood his land, understood that occupying soldiers hear what they expect to hear and ignore what seems ordinary. He'd used that understanding to save lives, and in doing so, he'd proven that heroism came in many forms, not always dramatic or obvious, not always recognized or rewarded, but real nonetheless. As real as sheep bleating in the Norman darkness, calling scattered soldiers home, one pattern of sounds at a time. The night, sky over Normandy had crackled with anti-aircraft fire on June 5, 1944. 80 men had jumped into that chaos and scattered across 12 square miles of enemy territory. 77 of them survived to fight another day, guided by a sound they'd never expected to hear and a farmer they'd never expected to meet. That was the miracle. Not sophisticated technology or perfect planning, but a man who knew his animals well enough to make them speak a language only the lost could understand. In the end, Pierre Leclerc's genius wasn't complicated at all. It was as simple as a sheep call carrying through darkness, as profound as knowing that even in war, even in occupation, the land and its creatures could become weapons in the hands of someone who truly understood them. And understanding, in war as in peace, was worth more than all the radios and codes and sophisticated equipment ever invented.